Good morning. Welcome to everyone here and everyone joining us online. We thank you for the opportunity that you're giving us to study, that we're given today to study together the Word of God, and hope that it blesses us throughout this week. Whether you're studying here in the Bible class, whether you're studying at home, whether you're studying the lesson that Chris is bringing this morning, I hope that it is a blessing to your life. I have an announcement up here. You'll be hearing this in the worship service also. But there's a form. There's some paper copies of it at the back near where you pick up communion. But there's also a QR code if you want to scan that. I believe it's also in the bulletin. But it's a form for personal opportunities for service and personal information update. So if you're interested in serving or you're currently serving in some of those, maybe put your name back on those. Make sure that people have your most up-to-date information. The church and the ministry leaders can contact you on those. This morning we are studying the account of Terah. Remember we talked about last week that the account of Terah, that the account ofs means that there's a transition between them. This is in Genesis chapter 11. You see at the end of chapter 11 it says, this is the account of Terah. And that's the transition actually to Abraham and his family for a little while, all the way until you get to Joseph. We're actually going to break that up over 2 weeks because that's a lot of material. I tried to condense it and do those fast forwardings like we did last week, but I'm going to continue. I'm just going to do Abraham and Isaac today, and then Jacob takes up another chunk that we'll do next week as we begin this. We've been studying. We're going to be studying Genesis as a story for these first 4 weeks of this series. And how does the book of Genesis tell the story of what is to come, and also the story of the past? Remember that this was a story written to the Israelites that are coming out of slavery. Israelites are coming out of slavery. Moses is writing to tell them the story of their past. And we talked about last week the generational flow, that it was easy to see that this could have been a literal translation that Moses heard passed down through there, because there wasn't that many generations in between him and between Adam and Abraham. It was the grandparents, even though there was a lot of generations in between, the lineage, the time frame, it was only one generation past that could have passed down that story. So as we look at that, as we look at this as the story of God's revealing relationship, his revealing his relationship to us, like any good story, we're going to take a look at specifically the covenant relationships. Because that's what really ties both the Old and the New Testament together. The beginning of the covenants that God gives with us. Covenant is a partnership. Both people have something invested into it. Both parties have something invested into a covenant relationship. And there's always some situation, but there's also stipulations, and there's also a blessing that comes because of it, or penalties that come if you don't uphold it. And so we're taking a look at those today, and specifically looking at the Abrahamic covenant. But like every good story, the covenantal story began long ago in a land far, far away, the Garden of Eden. It's there that God created humans in his image to be in relationship with him and to act as partners to help him spread goodness throughout the world. The word covenant isn't explicitly used in Genesis 1-3. That's the reason some scholars will say that that's not necessarily that the Adamic covenant wasn't necessarily a covenant. It detailed most of the things between it, but God didn't specifically call it a covenant like he does other ones. The Hebrew word barit, it was not used for that specific relationship. But the relationship context is very similar. The first parents of the world, Adam and Eve, were to live as priest kings on God's behalf, replicating and ruling over the world and representing his righteousness to all. They would enjoy the blessings of eternal life with God as long as they didn't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. To do so, however, would bring the curse of death on humanity. Sounds easy, right? Just don't do this one thing. Wrong. Unfortunately, we humans didn't live up to our end of the deal. Imagine that. Adam and Eve chose to disbelieve God and trust their own instincts about right and wrong. They sinned against God, fracturing the human-divine relationship and plunged humanity into sin and death. This fall accounts for the brokenness and corruption we experience in the world today. We'd be stuck in the wreckage of Genesis chapter 3 were it not for the divine intervention through all the covenantal relationships that happen throughout the rest of Genesis and throughout the Old Testament, and finally what we see through Jesus Christ. So here's those the 5 major covenants that are actually called covenants in the Old Testament and New Testament. There's no consensus on those, like I said, but some people put it as many as 9. Some scholars put as many as 9 because of those characteristics. But the ones that are actually called it are these 5. Sorry, some of those are kind of small from up here. But there's the first one that we see and we looked at last week was the Noahic covenant, the covenant with Noah, and that he would never bring upon destruction anytime through water, and he gave them a reminder. It was a one-sided covenant. This was actually one of those, he calls it a covenant, but it's actually a one-sided covenant. Noah didn't have to do anything. God just says, I'm not going to do this anymore. And he gives a covenant relationship with that. The second one that we're going to look at more today is the Abrahamic covenant. Abrahamic covenant is the covenant that he gives to Abraham, and that he starts revealing that in Genesis chapter 12, and we'll look more at that in 15 and 17 as well. So then it goes on to the covenant with Israel that he gives with called the Mosaic covenant. Then you have the Davidic covenant, which he says that there will be a king forever on the throne of Israel, and he reveals that through David, and he finally reveals that through King Jesus. And then he keeps going along until you get to the climax of the story that we have, that's the covenant with Jesus. So let's take a look at the Abrahamic covenant. God enters a redemptive partnership with Abraham, developed progressively as we see, as I said before, in Genesis 12, 15, and 17. He promises Abraham a huge family that will inherit a promised piece of land in Canaan and bring universal blessing to all humanity through his family. You can remember the promises that he gives to Abraham with these 3 things. He gives him an offspring, he gives him land, and he gives him a universal blessing. Chris talked about this in a lesson not that long ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago. But it was, he talked about that there are 3 parts of the blessing to Abraham: the offspring, the land, and then a universal blessing that's going to be a blessing to all people. But there was a stipulation to it. Abraham is to leave his land and follow God wherever he leads, walking blamelessly before God and training his family to do what is right and just, and keeping circumcision in every generation. This is both a conditional and unconditional covenant. God and man each have a part to play, but ultimately these promises will be fulfilled because God will see to it that they come to pass. The sign that this is to happen, a symbol setting this family apart to God, showing that their fertility and future lay in God's hands. Just as with every covenant, there's a situation, there's a promise, there's a stipulation, and then there's a sign for it to happen. The Noahic covenant, the sign was the rainbow. In the Abrahamic covenant, the sign is the circumcision. And we see that revealed as we see in Galatians, that the circumcision is now no longer a circumcision, a physical circumcision, but a circumcision of the heart. And so we see that this sign, this continues to go. The Abrahamic covenant is still a promise even to us today, that we are going to be blessed because of that. So now let's turn to beginning in Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, we're going to begin reading, and we're going to be doing like the fast forwarding that we did before. So there's going to be some times where I skip some scriptures because I'm covering all the way from 12 to 26. in Genesis today, but I'm also going to be pulling in some chapters that help to reveal some of the backstory with it, that you actually see when the New Testament authors pull this in together. We're actually going to be looking a little bit at Romans chapter 4. I'm going to pull in some scriptures from that when it pertains to it, and then Hebrews chapter 11. And I'll pause sometimes along the way as we go through that. So begin reading in Genesis chapter 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Now we're into Abram in Egypt. So this is those covenant relationship. You saw the promise. You saw that he was going to make him into a great nation, that he would reveal all of this to him along the line. But what was the condition? The condition was he had to leave. Now, if you look back at Genesis chapter 11, the account of Terah had already left the land of Ur. The land of Ur was in the middle of the Mesopotamian valley, a valley very rich, known for its fertility. He had already left that land with all of his family. And as Terah and all of his family left, they went up to Haran. Haran was a land that was a little bit less, but it was still very fertile. It was near the end, or the beginnings of the Tigris River. And so as you take a look at that, it was a good place for it to be, and it was separate from where they were before. God wanted them to leave this land of idolatry, and wanted them to go out on their own. He wanted them to believe in him throughout all that time. So now he asks them to go a little bit further. He asks them to go down to the land of Canaan. He says, "This is a land where I'm going to give you as your promise. This is the land I'm going to fulfill with you, and this is the land that you are going to see." But now there comes a different situation. Begin picking up again in the Bible. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while, because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake. And Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So he becomes very rich as a result of this time in Egypt. He made a poor choice. We find out later when he talks to Abimelech that Sarah really was technically his sister. They were half brother, half sister. So they were husband and wife also. And when they when he decides this, he's doing this out of fear, it seems like, as he does this. But God, even in the midst of that, still blesses him. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for the possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, "Look around from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. By faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Lot looked at faith. Lot looked by sight. Abraham looked by faith. Abraham knew that he could trust God no matter what. Lot looked and saw these were fertile grounds. This is a place that looks like it's going to be good to build my home. I see populous cities there. I see good things that can happen in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. I think that that's going to be a great place to live. We know from hindsight that those were some bad decisions on his part. And eventually he found himself in deep trouble. He took residence near Sodom. In retrospect, it was a very poor choice of real estate. Soon the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, and 3 other kings squared off in a battle against an enemy army. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah lost, and the cities were looted. Lot and his family were among the captives. When this news reached Abraham, he pulled together 318 trusted men and without hesitation set out to rescue his nephew. Their night attack caught the looters by surprise. Abram freed the captives and recovered their spoil, meeting a priest by the name of Melchizedek. He gave him 1/10 of the spoils and delivered to the king what rightly belonged to him. Despite Abram's growing sense of God's power, one problem remained that even the Almighty to Abram seemed unable to solve. It was Abram's greatest worry and the main topic of his dialogues with God. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." But Abram said, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abram said, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." Then the word of the Lord came to him. "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to them, "So shall your offspring be." Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. Against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations. Just as it had been said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. This is why it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, Abram believed that the promised child would come from his own body. But as far as he and Sarai knew, God didn't specify that Sarai would be the mother by this point in time. In a move common during this time, they decided that Sarai's slave, Hagar, an Egyptian woman, remember back in Egypt that he had gotten a whole lot of slaves from Egypt during the famine, would be a surrogate mother for the promised child. However, after Hagar conceived, she and Sarai quarreled, and Hagar was sent away, helpless and pregnant, to wander in the desert. Just as she despaired of her life, God spoke to her. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." For he said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers." Abram fell face down, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God." Then God said to Abraham, "As for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you for the generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." God also said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." When he had finished speaking with Abraham, God went up from him. On that very day, Abraham took his son Ishmael and all those born in his household or bought with his money, every male in his household, and circumcised them, as God told him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and his son Ishmael was 13. Abraham and his son Ishmael were both circumcised on that very day, and every male in Abraham's household, including those born in his household or bought from a foreigner, was circumcised with him. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be bought." I lost my place. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing by. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance to his tent, of his tent to meet them and bow low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed and then can go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered. "Do as you say." Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this same time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I'll return to you at this appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." When the men got up to leave, they looked towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them on their way. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him." Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. So Abraham enters into a bargaining phase with God at this point. He wants him to find 50 people. Then he wants him to find 40, and so on down until he finally gets to the point where he comes to this, and he says, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there? He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. Abraham thought, okay, I know Lot's there, I know his wife, I know his 2 daughters, I know their 2 son-in-laws, so that's 6. Maybe if God can find 4 more, the entire neighborhood of Sodom and Gomorrah will be saved. And then the angels go down to visit. The 2 angels that were with God at the time go down to visit. The 2 angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. My lords, he said, please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning. No, they answered, we will spend the night in the square. But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. The men of Sodom demonstrated their wickedness very soon. And as one voice called for Lot to turn over the angels to them, the angels struck the crowd with blindness, and they then warned Lot and all his family to leave the city and flee to the mountains. But only his wife and 2 daughters left with him, because his son-in-laws thought that it was a joke. Lot pleaded for him, though, to live in a city nearby, because he didn't think he could make it in the mountains. He'd become a city dweller rather than a pastoral care, and so he wanted to live in the city called Zoar, and the angels permitted this. But by the time that Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen over the land. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those cities, all those living in the cities, and also the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. Lot and his daughters had settled in the mountains for fear of the people of Zoar. He thought he was a city person, but because of what they had seen, he was afraid that he was going to bring bad calamity to them, so he went up into the mountains anyways. Lot's daughters then made poor choices based on fear instead of faith, and had children by their father Lot. Their children became the Moabites and the Ammonites that were a pestilence of the descendants of Abraham until the time of King David. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife, Sarah, she is my sister. Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, you are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman. This sounds a little bit familiar from the time back in Egypt. And Abimelech asked Abraham, what was your reason for doing this? Abraham replied, I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham, and he returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, my land is before you. Live wherever you like. Once again, even in the midst of Abraham's deception, and the partial deception in this, then he was still blessed, because God is still in the blessing business no matter what the situation is. He always he's looking for opportunities to bless you. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God commanded him. Abram was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. God gave Abraham a child of promise, but Abraham had a child already through Hagar. His name was Ishmael. What would become of him? The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking, and she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly, because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its thorns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering, instead of his son. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." This mountain Moriah, where Abraham received or was tested by God, and he responded in a way that he was willing to sacrifice his only son because he believed. And Hebrews comes back and explains this to us, that he said, well, if I do this, well, God could raise him from the dead, because he said specifically he was going to do this, so I'm going to trust him no matter what. And he was willing to do it. Isaac was probably walking up the mountain wondering, why am I carrying this? I don't see anything. What's going on with this, as he explained in the text. But he revealed that we're going to trust God, that God's going to provide through this. But this same mountain eventually later on becomes the spot where David offers a sacrifice to God. David had sinned, and he had given he had done a census because he was trusting once again in sight instead of trusting in faith. And he stops the census, and right there was the point where the angel stopped the pestilence that was covering over in 2 Samuel. And then and David offered a sacrifice there. Later on, this becomes the site for the site for the temple. This is where God enters in for the first time in Solomon's temple, where the glory of God enters into the temple. And later on, very near to this same place, is the same place where where Jesus was offered up on the cross. This one site is where Abraham tested his son, was tested with his son Isaac. Bears that true to see that his one and only son leads all the way through to Jesus, the one and only son that was not spared from that sacrifice, that God was willing to offer his one and only son as a sacrifice, not as a test, but as a sacrifice for the cleansing of our sins. Back to the story. Eventually, Sarah died, and Abraham bought a field and buried her, wondering all the while what would become of him and Isaac and God's promise. Abraham had taken another wife, a woman named Keturah, and had more children. Yet his entire estate went to the special son of his promise, Isaac. Abraham died when he was 175 years old and was laid to rest next to Sarah. But the story is far from over. Isaac married Rebekah, a member of Abraham's family. The story goes of how one of Abraham's servants went up to choose back to the land of Haran, where his father's family was still residing, and he went back up there, and God provided Rebekah through revelation to the servant, and Rebekah was brought back. Now Isaac had come from Beer Lahai Roi, for he was living in the Negev. He went out to the field one evening to meditate, and as he looked up, he saw camels approaching. Rebekah looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel and asked the servant, "Who is that man in the field coming to meet us?" "He is my master," the servant answered. So she took her veil and covered herself. 20 years after the wedding, the couple was still childless. But in response to many prayers, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the other will serve the younger. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out, with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country. While Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents, Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Our final chapter in chapter 26. Now there was a famine in the land besides the previous famine in Abraham's time, and Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines in Gerar. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all these lands. And through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions." So Isaac stayed in Gerar. When the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister," because he was afraid to say, "She is my wife." He thought, "The men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah, because she is beautiful." When Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac caressing his wife Rebekah. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, "She is really your wife. Why did you say she is my sister?" Isaac answered him, "Because I thought I might lose my wife on account of her." Then Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the men might well have slept with your wife, and you have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech gave orders to all the people, "Anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Isaac planted the crops in the land, and the same year he reaped 100-fold, because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. So all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with earth. So Abimelech said to Isaac, "Move away from us. You have become too powerful for us." From there he went up to Beersheba. That night the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." The story of Abraham and the covenantal relationship continues to unfold. The story goes from generation to generation. And we see here the promise wasn't just to Abraham, but to his descendants. Also, as God reminds Isaac of the covenant relationship that he had made with Abraham. Remember that this book of Genesis is originally intended to tell a nation who had been slaves for the last 400 years of their past, and how if God blessed them in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he could do it again as they are about to enter the land that had been promised to Abraham and Isaac and that they had inhabited so long ago. The names and locations are important for the people as they are about to see the changes to the land over time as they enter back into the land of Canaan. When the Israelites come to inhabit the land, will they see a land of promise, or will they see a land of fear? Will they trust in God like Abraham did with Isaac? Will they remember that God set a conditional covenant relationship with Abraham for them to inherit if they will honor their side of the covenant? But this wouldn't be any fun for us today in 2022 if we didn't see how the covenants pointed towards and were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. That's the best part. The New Testament presents Jesus as the offspring of Abraham, who trusted his father even to the point of death, and so became a blessing to all nations. He is the obedient Israelite who perfectly kept, fulfilled, and thus transcended the law of God. He is the royal son of David who inaugurated God's kingdom in his life, death, and resurrection. He now sits at the right hand of God, reigning as shepherd king over the earth, and will continue to reign over the new creation. Think about it. Jesus perfectly succeeded at every point that humans failed. This makes him the guarantor and the mediator of the new and better covenant. Now people from every nation, tribe, and tongue who are joined to Jesus in faith are part of God's covenant family and experience the rich blessings of the new covenant. In this new covenant, we get total forgiveness of sins and cleansing from shame. We get new hearts of flesh and the indwelling Spirit, causing us to love God's laws and to walk in His ways. We can actually do justice and righteousness and so be a light to all the nations. In light of the biblical storyline, that's amazing. We can walk in freedom and light rather than sin and darkness. We have bold access to God and stand in the realm of grace. We trust that a renewed world is coming where peace and righteousness will reign forever under the rule of Jesus. And it's all possible because of Him, the perfect covenant keeper. Next week, we'll be taking a look at the life of Jacob. Hope that you'll join us again then. Thanks.